Hello and welcome to The Close Read, the official podcast of the Claremont Review of Books. Listeners, as always, can find us at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. And of course, you can also subscribe to get the Dead Tree edition delivered right to your mailbox if you don't already. It's always my joy and pleasure whenever a new issue of the CRB comes out to sit down with a few authors from the issue and just go a little deeper into what they've written. We think that a lot of our reviews and essays merit further discussion. That's why we print them. But in particular, we want to buttonhole a few authors each time and just chat with them. I'm Spencer Clavin. I'm the associate editor of the CRB, and I am joined today by Jeff Anderson. Jeffrey H. Anderson served as director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice from 2017 to 2021. He has an essay in the latest CRB, the summer 2021, called The Masking of America. And it's the case, it is the case against masks, but it's deeper and more profound than that. I think it uses masks to speak about the logic of the lockdown regime, makes the definitive case, in my view, against wearing masks to protect against COVID-19. And I'm going to read from just a portion of the opener here so you can get a sense for Jeff's argument. Obviously, you should go to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com and read the whole thing. Many Americans, writes Jeff, have been taught to believe that masks work, at least a little, and that wearing them comes at a minimal cost. Nearly the opposite is true. The best scientific evidence invites a far less rosy assessment of masks' effectiveness than is broadcast by public health officials. And the dubious health benefits of widespread mask wearing come at an enormous social cost, which is almost never acknowledged by those writing and enforcing the mandates. Seeing and showing the face is a fundamental aspect of human existence. A society that forgets this straightforward truth will likely also fail to realize that faceless people may make for compliant subjects, but not generally for good citizens. We may distinguish those cases when masks are worn for special occasions, Halloween, Carnival, classic Greek plays. Nor will COVID-19 be the last time public health officials and governors demand we embrace mask wearing. The question is whether Americans and the legislators who most closely represent them will realize the high costs of wearing masks before this new and noxious practice becomes ingrained in our culture. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today to talk more about this wonderful essay.
Thank you for having me on, Spencer. It's good to talk to you.
It's a pleasure. Well, I know you've got another piece that probably by the time listeners hear this will be live at City Journal, and that piece will deal more in depth with the science of why mask wearing is sort of inadequately defended, doesn't work. There's some of that in here, but I wanted to drill down with you into these cultural aspects that you raise, and in particular, since you've written this, of course, there have been some news developments around masking, around vaccination, around COVID-19. And I wanted to start by just inviting you to comment a little bit on that. The CDC now says that even if you are fully vaccinated, you should wear a mask inside in areas of high transmission in public. To me, as a layman, this strikes me as a kind of ratcheting up, as a new level of illogic and absurdism. But I wanted to get your take on that first and just see whether that's the correct assessment here and why you think we've now, if that's true, why it is that we've now moved into this new stage of the whole thing.
Yeah, Spencer, I certainly agree. I think it's very true. I wrote the piece in part because I was convinced that this would not be the last we heard of the masks. They would be back. Maybe a bad seasonal flu would hit, what have you, and we would be asked to don the mask, and that the public health officials would want to make this a permanent part of our society, of our culture, in a way that it never has been in the past, and I would argue should not be. I didn't think it would come so quickly. I didn't think that we would be.
You were more right than you thought or hoped you would be.
Right. I was not expecting that in August of 2021 we'd already be back to that point or to that point. And I mean, it's clear that the public health officials have there's no end to their appetite for mask wearing.
And this is, it seems to me, something that is true in principle. I mean, as you indicate, it's not so much that this is a science-driven policy as this is something that, we could, by the same logic that we've been masking up for COVID-19, it seems that we could have been masking up for any other number of seasonal viruses, et cetera. What's your read on the people's response to this new set of directives? Because as you emphasize in the piece, right, really it's up to us whether we're going to comply. And I've been seeing a real range of responses just regionally, and out here in Tennessee is very different from where my friends on the coasts live and so forth. How would you grade the American people on catching wise to this?
I think it sort of still remains to be seen. I mean, I think it's somewhat encouraging that there's more pushback, I think, now than there was, say, a year ago or 15 months ago when there was a sort of surprisingly low degree of pushback against the mask wearing, I thought. You certainly saw it, but I would have expected Americans to be less willing to put on the masks. I think it did become, for a lot on the left, an element of virtue signaling and signaling that they were anti-Trump, et cetera, and that helped fuel it. But more recently, I think people are expressing a sense that they've had it with this, they're fed up with it, and especially in light of the fact that, as you alluded to, the science on this suggests that there's little to no evidence that the masks prevent the spread of viruses, and there's some scientific evidence that they actually increase the spread of viruses.
Yes, just to sort of digest that argument very, very briefly, one of the points that struck me most about your piece is that you emphasize, and I think I vaguely somewhere in the back of my brain knew this, but it's so easy to forget these things with the kind of constant drumbeat of propaganda, that randomized control trials are really the gold standard of research in this kind of area. It's a totally different methodology than observational studies where you just kind of look at what's going on. And to actually isolate the cause of a thing, you need to be able to study that thing in isolation. So it stands to reason. And you emphasize that there really is, that the RCTs don't really give us any evidence that masks help at all. I mean, that hasn't changed, right, since you wrote the essay.
No, it hasn't changed at all. And I do go into that more thoroughly in the City Journal piece. But yeah, the randomized controlled trials prevent researchers from just finding what they want to find. As you said, they allow you to isolate a variable, see cause and effect. Observational studies are more like sociology, where you just look around and you see what's happening and you draw conclusions, and people will draw different conclusions. They're very prone to bias and being politicized. And it's these observational studies that the CDC is entirely relying upon in trying to justify its mask mandates. It's not using any randomized controlled trials because the 14 randomized controlled trials that have looked into this have not provided any support for the CDC's position. And in fact, there is some evidence that the masks are even counterproductive, particularly cloth masks. And the way they can be counterproductive is that the virus gets on the mask, then people touch the mask and they touch their eyes, they touch something else, they touch someone, and it spreads more perhaps in that way than in the air. But there's not a lot of evidence on either side, and there's certainly not the kind of evidence you'd expect to support a kind of sea change in our cultural understanding of masks and whether it makes any sense to hide our faces.
Right. And, one of the things that this point you make raises for me is it actually goes wider and broader than COVID-19. And that's not just that, randomized control trials don't support what's going on. It's that these studies aren't being done. I mean, you would think after these many months, like I've lost count at this point of lockdown and pandemic, that there would be an army of scientists trying to gather exactly the kind of evidence. But it's similar to, the flood of people who are fleeing progressive blue states into red states. You would think a million sociological, PhDs would be being written on this topic. Not so much. And it does sort of speak to this, the religious aspect of it or the moral aspect of it or whatever you want to call it. You say in the piece, the day after the CDC endorsed nationwide mask wearing, President Trump announced, "I won't be doing it personally." From that instant, the mask quickly became a symbol of civic virtue, a sort of Black Lives Matter flag that could be hung from one's face. For many, it conveyed a trio of virtues. I'm unselfish, I'm pro-science. I'm anti-Trump. What it also conveyed, incidentally, was a rejection of long-standing Western norms, unhealthy risk aversion, credulous willingness to embrace unsupported health claims, and a pallid view of human interaction. Now, I find this quite perceptive, and I certainly observe that kind of reasoning, if you can call it that, going on around me in situations that are high mask situations. I see people doing things with masks that obviously are not going to help, pulling them down over their face half the time. It becomes this kind of marker for people, a cultural marker. And I wanted to ask you, now that we've sort of extracted the Trump of it all from the situation, or at least the actual fact of him in office, do you think that has had an effect on this dynamic, or are people just now so locked into their positions that masks mean what they mean at this point?
I think, unfortunately, people are pretty locked in. And I think you see a tremendous difference between right and left on this. I hope there's some fluidity in the middle, hopefully toward the non-masking side. But you covered a lot there. And let me go back to what you were talking about with the randomized control trials and how they're not being done. I'm sure the CDC is desperately looking for someone to do that one RCT that will find some evidence that is statistically significant that masks work. But in the meantime, there's only been one randomized control trial done during the COVID-19 period. It was in Denmark, and it found that after a month, 2% of the people in the mask group had gotten COVID-19, and 2% of the people in the non-mask group had gotten COVID-19. And needless to say, the CDC is not highlighting this study, even though it is again, RCTs, randomized control trials, are the gold standard in medical research, and observational studies are comparatively not at all trustworthy. But the CDC has seen an opportunity here, I think, to grab a tremendous amount of power. Public health officials, just by their nature, love public health interventions. This is their heyday right now.
Yeah.
What I hope people will gradually see is two things. One, that there is no real scientific basis for these intrusive mandates. And two, that they'll start to appreciate more fully what really should be obvious, and that is the high costs we pay by wearing masks. And I guess a third thing I'd throw in there would be I hope people start to realize that government by public health official is totally inappropriate for a republic, and so is government by executive officials. And we need to get our legislatures back from their AWOL status and have them be making the decisions on such matters, because they're the ones who most closely represent us and are designed to refine and enlarge public opinion rather than thwart it.
Let me pick up on that last point about legislatures, because it seems key, and it's only become more central. I mean, we now have this eviction moratorium that Biden effectively expects to be struck down in the courts, meaning he knows it's unconstitutional. He didn't have the votes to do it in Congress. He did it anyway. And so it seems as if, this has been a governing theme of American politics for as long as I've been alive, that, the big gap is Congress and also local legislatures. It also seems to me as if any Republican who wanted to sweep some of these purple areas where people, as you say, are in the middle, they may be figuring it out, would only have to say, I'm doing away with all of these mandates. I mean, I look at somebody like Ron DeSantis out in Florida, and it seems as if that's an incredibly winning message. Do you agree? I mean, what do you think the strategy for 2022, 2024 should be for Republicans going forward, if they want to really kind of engage in COVID politics, as I suppose they'll have to?
Well, it's always nice when pushing for what is right and good and just actually can lead to winning votes. And I think this is absolutely such a case. I mean, DeSantis is the perfect example. I mean, I think he has done everything right during this period, and is positioned extremely well for a possible run for the presidency. Others hopefully will, and some already are, following his lead and being actively against the masks. I live in Virginia, and the race here is hinging to some extent on, will schools stay open in person? It's a little unclear at this point whether Youngkin, the Republican nominee, is going to come out strongly against the masks, or simply take a little more of I guess I'd call it a Chamber of Commerce type position of let's keep things open, but let's we're fine with hiding our faces or forcing vaccinations or what have you. I think that whole package of things is a winning message for the American people. And it's certainly consistent with how we've done things in the past. We are not a nation that has hidden the face or required vaccine passports or any of this sort of stuff. So I think there's much political hay to be made over this.
Yeah, you make a remarkable point about children, which is that infants are known to form their sense of human selfhood, of facial expressions, and all sorts of things from looking at other people's faces, adults' faces in their formative years. And I think that the arguments that you make, which are obviously true for everybody, that seeing and showing the face is central and crucial to the building of a society that's recognizably Western, become more apparent when you start talking about people's kids, and people, I think, maybe connect to it emotionally at a deeper level when you bring that up. I want to ask you now to speculate about something you've been mentioning a couple times, and that's the surprising willingness of the American public, at least the first time around, to go for this. Shocked me as well. And I have been turning over in my mind theories about why it might be that at a cultural level, we were suddenly so willing to submit to something like this. I mean, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's a bit of a complicated question. I think some of it is we've long readers of the Claremont Review of Books are certainly aware of the low horizon of health and wealth, the sort of Hobbesian horizon, I would call it, which now seems to be tilting just toward health. And there's a desire on the part of the public health officials and others to embrace cowardice as a virtue, essentially, excessive risk aversion. I highlight in the piece that the Spanish flu in 1918 was more than 100 times as likely to kill an American under the age of 40 as COVID-19 has been. And yet we have just had a panicked reaction to this. I don't know. I think so an excessive embrace of health, an excessive willingness to trust these experts who really don't deserve our respect. And I think, as I mentioned before, a kind of forgetting of the obvious. Americans used to understand I think they mostly do intuitively still, but they perhaps have to have the rational arguments presented a little more clearly now than in the past. That, I would say there's three main reasons why masks pose tremendously high cost to society. One is that they're uncomfortable and they're unhygienic. Americans were meant to, or not just Americans, human beings were meant to feel the sun or wind on their face, not a moist piece of fabric.
Right.
The second would be the greatly compromised human interaction you talk about, especially with children. And there's nothing more ludicrous than watching these poor kids running around outside. My kids came back from reporting that the Vacation Bible School down at the church down the street from us has kids running around outside with masks on in the 90-degree heat today. I mean, that's just insane.
Yep.
And then the third thing is you also alluded to earlier about the fact that the masks hide the individual identity of a human being, and the fact that that's how we identify people. It's by the face. And when you don't see someone's face, it's a lot easier to view us as just a faceless blob rather than people who each have God-given unalienable rights that need to be respected. So I think, for all those reasons, the masks are horrible, but those reasons are not necessarily always right at people's fingertips, even though I think they do intuitively understand that there's something rather non-Western and amiss about all this.
There's a psychological element to everything that you've just said, which really is a thread that runs throughout this whole essay. You begin with a piece in The Guardian, reports about folks who aren't ready to give up their masks for reasons having nothing to do with health, right? This is sort of psychological crutch. Becca, a 25-year-old bookstore employee near Chicago, reports that she and her coworkers prefer not having customers see our faces because with a mask, I don't have to smile at them or worry about keeping a neutral face. Another one says it has been such a relief to feel anonymous. It's like having a force field around me that says, don't see me. Those are striking statements, and they speak directly to the kind of stuff you are talking about. It almost sounds as if, at a certain extreme, people actually want out of all of the things you're saying. They want out of citizenship. They want out of Republican government. They want out of living together in community. That can't be everybody. I mean, that must be an extreme minority, surely. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I don't think most people are so eager to bring this is almost like bringing the Facebook or Twitter world into your everyday world, right? And, you don't have to interact with anybody when you're online in your social media existence in any full sense, and you're also not obligated to do so when you're actually interacting with them. You can
Right.
still kind of keep them at a distance, not be forced to smile, etc. But no, I think most people find them to be horribly uncomfortable and an amazing intrusion upon any kind of communication. But they're afraid to say so because they're viewed to be wanting to kill grandma or something if they express that point of view. The loss of facial expressions is really remarkable. Charles Darwin, as I mentioned in the piece, wrote an entire book on human facial expressions and expressions that the animals use as well, not facial expressions. And he goes through and talks about how he quotes Shakespeare throughout and talks about how Juliet's blushing is perhaps the best. Anyone blushing is the best indication of uniquely human expressiveness. But there's countless ways in which we communicate subtle things through our facial expressions that are now just missed. And for somebody to think that none of that matters is really remarkable. I mean, I sometimes wonder whether these often left-leaning people who act like facial expressions don't matter and they don't care if they can see someone smile at them or not, whether they would tolerate having their dog's tail not be able to wag in front of them somehow, if there were somehow masking of the tail wagging. I don't think they would, but they're buying into this for some reason.
Well, it's an astonishing point, and I think there's something very deep there that this is essentially a real-life version of social media in forms of interaction, which are masked, which do have this kind of facade. And one of the central points, arguments that I've been having with friends and online during this time is around this question whether a Zoom meeting is a fitting substitute for an in-person interaction, whether virtual church is the same as church in person, all of these things. I mean, on some level, I think you're absolutely right that the real crisis in front of us is people who don't believe that in-person human interaction has some kind of irreplaceable quality that you can't just kind of upload into the cloud. In the brief time that remains to us, I would love to just hear from you. For folks that are listening, I'm imagining a lot of our listeners are going to be sympathetic to the Don't Bring Back Masks project. And I wonder what you think are the ways that people who maybe don't have big platforms, who just go about living their lives, how do people fight back best against this sort of second wave of masking?
That's a good question, Spencer. I think everybody can do their part if they oppose the masking. Reading up on the lack of legitimate scientific basis for this and how the CDC and others are eschewing these randomized control trials, pretending they don't exist. I mean, I think that's helpful. That's important to know. But even more so is probably just highlighting, like you say, the importance of being able to see each other's faces, of being able to communicate in a normal fashion. If we were living through the Black Death of medieval Europe, and if masks worked, which I think that's not at all clear that they do, maybe we'd be in a different situation, but we're clearly not. And we need to focus more on what we're losing from this instead of taking the CDC's word about what we're gaining. And I think that, again, the putting pressure on our legislatures to get involved in this is crucial. This whole COVID period has been a case study in the breakdown of the separation of powers that the founders so believed in. This is what you get when, instead of having the entity that most closely represents the people, the legislatures, instead of having them make decisions, you have, as anyone can see, executives who very quickly become quite power hungry, and public health officials who have never had any real power and now are just, they've got to be basking in the control that they can exercise over their fellow human beings. I'm sure they've convinced themselves it's for their fellow citizens' good, but still, we have seen this evidence overwhelmingly that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and It's time to get the legislatures in the game and make sure that the actual opinion of the citizenry is being registered and implemented.
Well said. Well, you can arm yourself with the relevant scientific information by reading Jeff's latest in City Journal. And for the deep dive into a political philosophy argument for why this is a pernicious thing at a cultural level, you should check out The Masking of America at Claremont Review of Books.com. You'll have heard it featured perhaps on Tucker Carlson. We've now discussed it at length, and it's well worth reading if you haven't already. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Spencer. My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Close Read, a Claremont Review of Books podcast and a production of the Claremont Institute. Our publisher is Ryan Williams. Our producer is Jake Gannon, and I'm your host, Spencer Clavin. Thanks to Benjamin Squirett for our music. If you liked this episode and you'd like to hear more in-depth interviews based on the Claremont Review of Books, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're available on all major platforms. And if you'd like to support us, we encourage you to leave a 5-star review on iTunes. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you again next time.